Hello, it's Kazoo and
Dark Yodeler.
and today he'll be talking to you about Flask. And subscribe to Kazoo and Dark Yodeler, please.
So we're going to walk through a little bit of Flask about how to set up some simple templates and pass messages or variables that you want to display in your templates, as well as sharing data and posting data with the Flask framework. So to start off, let's look over here at our code. And so we have a very simple Flask application with a single route that says hello world. To start working with Flask, you import the Flask library, instantiate a Flask application, and that's it. So if we start this up, let's see here, and we go Flask run, we're going to see that I can now refresh this, and that's going to show on our display, hello world. I have another browser for another session that's also saying hello world. So with that very simple application, we have a complete HTTP web application that's handling routes and redirecting packets that hit those routes to execute certain functions to return a response. That is an important part about Flask, is that when we're talking about the routes, a lot of times people think in the URL, and if I just write that in here, we have www, which is a subdomain. Then we have the domain, which would be example, and the top level domain there, which is .com. After that, this whole thing is the path or URL to a specified resource. When we're working with a web application or framework like Flask, this path is a route and is mapped to a Python function that will generate an HTTP response to send back. That path is not representing some logical resource on a file drive like you would see with HTML or static files that are being served through an HTTP server. So with that, right now, our website, our web page that we're returning just has the very simple thing that says hello world. If we look into that a little bit and inspect that, we can look at the source there, and you can see there's really not much information. And if we're going to spend our whole time just returning strings, that's a lot of effort to return a properly formatted HTML response object. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a template here. So inside my Flask application, as kind of a sibling to my application.py, I'm going to add a folder called templates, and templates is going to be the default store for these HTML templates that we're going to write in what's called Jinja. And I'm going to add a new file in there, and I'm going to call it base. So base.html. And with base.html, let me switch that up to just straight up HTML. Get some boilerplate. There we go. So I'm providing a simple structure for my document, for my HTML document. We'll call this Flask intro. And we're going to put a placeholder in here for other templates. So I'm going to create a block content. And we're going to end that block. So what this allows us to do is we can reuse or inherit that base template and then just put what we want to see into this template. That makes it really convenient to reuse and not have to rewrite the HTML all over the place. So we come back over here to our application, and we're still not making use of that template. In order to make use of that, we're going to import a function from Flask called render template. And now, instead of just returning hello world, we can return, render template, and we're going to pass the name of a template. And for now, we're going to create one more called home.html, and I want to create a variable called message equals that. So I would like to render the home HTML template with the message hello world. We don't have a home template, so I'm going to add one. So we add this, we're going to call it home.html, and when we look at this, rather than rewriting all of our HTML, I'm just going to start at the top of my file. I'm going to say this extends base.html. So I'm going to save that, and we're going to then write the content that we want to show up in that block that's in our base.html. So if we look at that, that is called block content. So I'm just going to define a block content right here. End block. And I'm just going to put a little bit of HTML in here. So h1, and then I want to display the value of my message parameter. And close off my h1, save that. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to restart my server. And now, if we refresh that, let me show you the web page. If I refresh, suddenly we have a fully qualified document that is taking our base.html and putting the placeholder content from my home.html and rendering it. Where's my mouse? Right here. So that's nice. Again, we're keeping this pretty simple. But what if I want to display, let's say, a list of names? So we're going to make a little web application that's going to be able to, you can add names to it. So here we go. So I'm defining a names list, and I'm just going to put my own name in there. So Todd. And we're going to pass in another variable here, or parameter, called names equals names. I'm going to save that. And now in my home template, I'm going to say, all right, well, if names, and we've just created an if block. So now if names has any content in it, if it's defined, it will start to render out this block. And I'm going to create just a list of the names. And then I'm going to iterate. So for name in names. And then we're going to end that for loop in for. I would like a list item that prints out the value of that name. So now we can look here. We're only going to get one name. Let me restart my server. And now when I refresh this, I'm going to close my developer tools from now on. But now we can see that, hey, look, I'm rendering out that list of names. So any names that are in that list will be rendered out on my page. And I can refresh that over here and see, all right, the same display. So I have two different browsers, two different clients that are reaching out to my web application and getting dynamic information from it. But if we want to display a list of names, we don't necessarily want to have to hard code them into our application every time. So let's look at how we would handle posting information. To start with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form on this page. And we're going to say form action. So what URL or route do we want to post to? And I'm going to say URL. This is a function for Jinja or Flask, where I can say URL for So I'm going to utilize this URL for, pass in the name of a function, and this will output the URL. This is a Flask function that will output the URL that is mapped, or the route that is mapped to this function. And we're going to use the method equals post and start up this form. And my form is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to have a single input in here of type equals text, and name equals name, and that's it. And then we're going to have another input to submit or trigger that post. Type equals submit, and value equals add name. So this isn't hooked up to anything in the background. In fact, that might. So let's add a simple route here real quick. So at app.route, and we are going to call this one, slash add name, and let's leave that out there. I'll show that in a second. So def add name, there's nothing in here, and I'm going to pass that for now. All right, so that function name right there is what we're adding as the argument for my URL4. The argument for URL4 is not the name of the route, it's the name of the function. And then Flask behind the scenes will find that function and output the name of the route. So that way we can change the route all we want, but our HTML is always going to render out correctly because we're going to pull out whatever the route is as it's defined in our application. It makes maintenance significantly easier as your application grows in complexity. All right, so let's restart that and just see what that form looks like. So I'm going to refresh, and we just have a simple form. Now, that function doesn't do anything, so let's look at how we can add some functionality here. In order to pull form data out, we need to import another piece. We're going to import the request object from Flask, and that way we could say, all right, name equals request.form, because we're accessing the form data in the request, and I'm just going to use a getter. That way, if there is no form data, it will return null instead of failing. And I'm looking for the key name. That key is defined by the name of the input field. That's how that key gets generated. So I'm looking for the value that's mapped to the key name, and then we're just going to say names.append that name. So this is going to add whatever values in the form to this list of names. And now I want to return. But instead of returning and rendering a new web page, I just want to redirect back to the home screen with the new name data. So with that, I'm going to import one more thing, the redirect. And we're going to redirect and use that URL for, but I'm going to import that one from Flask as well. So I'm going to say URL for hello as a string. So what that's going to do, it's going to find the path for hello, and once it's processed the post, it's going to redirect there. In order for this to work with a post, I'm going to explicitly state the methods that this function, this route can handle, and that takes an array, and I'm just going to say this one only will handle post. So if you try to do a GET request to add name, it's going to fail. And we're going to save that and restart. So looking at that, if I come and refresh my page, we're not going to see much very different here, but we do have this add name. And now if I type in, for example, Bill, hit add name, it redirects. So it processed adding the name to the list and then redirected to the home page, which has a function to list out all the names that are in that list of names. So I can continue to add names here. So we're going to add Alice, and there we go. We're printing those out. We've created a dynamic form that's handling the manipulation of data on the server side and displaying that manipulated data on the client side after every refresh. And if I go over here and I refresh my app, we're going to see those names are, since I'm using them as a variable, they're going to be the same. That data structure is going to be the same for every single client that's out there. Okay. Well, what if we want to add some names to our list, kind of pre-populate it with some predefined values? Flask has a nice functionality to add CLI commands. So we can have some management commands within Flask, and you can utilize that to do some migrations, or you could pre-populate a database with data. I want to show an example, and I'm going to tell you ahead of time this is not going to work, and then we'll talk about why. So here we go. So what we did is we added our app.cli.command right here, and we said add names. It's going to, Flask as an application is going to look for that add names in your command line, and it's going to execute this function where I'm just saying append Kazoo, Nethario, Lizzie Mag, Peppa, and Wesley to my names list that's in that Flask application. When I run Flask --help, you can see that add names is listed as an available command, and it's pulling my doc string add names for the list as the help text. So this is a way that you can put these in here and have them available. And when I type in Flask add names, all right, it added the names. So what I would hope to see in my web application is I would hope to see all those names added. But as I refresh, they're not added. And the reason they're not added is when we look at this, that CLI piece, it's only going to have, it has its own separate application context. So we're not able to manipulate the already running variable list of names in the web application. So it's not persistent. It's not going to really do much for us. So that doesn't work. The next step that some people might see is, okay, well, what about utilizing sessions? So I can put data into the individual requests so that the Firefox and Chrome users or individual users aren't sharing the entire same set of data right there from a session standpoint. So to work with the sessions, we're going to import one more piece. We're going to import the session object from Flask. And rather than have this names up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if names is not in session, meaning there's no key value pair. So session is just session specific data that's kept in a key value pair state. It's kind of like a dictionary. So if names isn't instantiated there, I'm going to say session, and I'm going to create that, names equals, and we're just going to have this list here. And then now that it's instantiated, in order to pass that to my template, I'm going to pass it into a variable here where I say session names. So I'm assigning that, and this names here is going to get passed in, and it's going to hold whatever's in my session. The other thing, though, is that now this names doesn't exist. That means that my post function is broken. So I'm going to add that here where I say, instead of names, I'm going to say session names, append names. All right, so let's restart our server. And now when we refresh this, oh, that's right. So session is not going to work without a secret key because it uses the key to encode the cookies and the data, how that data is stored with the session. So I just need to say app.secretKey equals, this is a terrible key. That secret key is the key to unlock and unencrypt the data, or to not protect that data. So you want to keep that safe and not check in a production key into GitHub or anything. All right. Let's restart that server. And now let's look at our... Okay, I'm going to re-add Bill here. There we go. All right. All right. So in making sure that I can work with that, with the session value in the post, I'm taking this names, and I'm gonna have names hold on to whatever the value is that's in the session, modify that, and then I just overwrite. So I'm saying, okay, session names equals that new list. When I do that, we're able to see that in the browser, Bill's gonna be showing up because I added Bill. Now let's refresh this, but Bill doesn't show up in this browser. So let me add Alice here. And Alice shows up. But if I refresh the other client, Alice doesn't show up, but Bill is still there. So by utilizing session, I'm able to begin to separate information that I'm sharing with each client and keeping data that is specific to each client. But every time my application resets, that session data, if we look at this, here we go. So it's going to get maintained because that session is being attached to the cookie that's being sent to the browser. So the browser is including that session data with the server. So there is some persistence across, but that data would disappear if I deleted my cookies on my browser. So it is considered volatile data, and we don't want to just throw a bunch of stuff in there. So now the question would be, if I, well then, okay, if I can put this thing in a session variable, well then maybe then my CLI command would be able to add and manipulate the session data. So let's do the same thing we did with our post, where we say names equals session names, and then come down here and say session, we're going to reassign it, names equals names. Awesome. So now I'm hoping this is at least going to put this into that session variable. And if we go and look at our piece here, and let's get a better look. Okay. If I say, all right, now Flask add names. Whoa, that's not working at all. And it gives me this handy error message that says we're working outside of the request context. And that's an important part about the CLI. The command line tools within Flask aren't just going to, they're not going to help you manipulate things within a request context, meaning the HTTP request that a client is sending. But it does allow you context to the application state. Meaning we can manipulate things like database objects or other pieces of data that we may want to add, or functionality that we need to add from an administrative standpoint, but not to manipulate variables that are request specific, because we do not have the context of every individual request. The session object is something that is an individual request context. And that kind of brings up, well, if we can't manipulate that data on the session or data that's in memory, how do we get that data into the application? How do we work with something that's more persistent long term? And that's where our database operations come into play. In order to set up the database, we're going to utilize Flask SQLAlchemy here. And I already have that installed on the command line. So from Flask SQLAlchemy, we're going to import SQLAlchemy. There are a few configuration pieces that come with that, and in order to configure Flask SQLAlchemy to work, we're going to add just at least two options here. We need to give it a URI to write or connect to the Flask SQLAlchemy database or the SQLite database that we're going to utilize. And I'm also just setting this value because I know it's deprecated and I don't want it to be super noisy. Once we have the configuration set, we can then say db is what I'm going to call my SQLAlchemy equals the output of SQLAlchemy by passing in the app. So this is going to create a database object with the application context. So this is where our utilities, our command line utilities, come in handy. Because no database exists yet. I've just created the connection information in my SQLAlchemy application. So I'm going to create another CLI function. So I say app.cli.command. And here I'm going to say initdb. And we're going to say def initdb. So now I'm going to add some docstring, initialize SQLite database. And I just grab that database object and I'm going to say drop all. So that's going to, if the database exists, it's going to delete all of our data. And then I'm going to run db create all. And then that's going to create the structure of the tables. This is very handy, especially when you are developing and you're adding and removing data parameters, types, things like that. You can do real quick, rewrite the database structure so that it maps to the data that you're creating. But right now I don't have any tables. I haven't defined any. So to define objects in Flask, what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to create a class name, and it inherits from DB model. I'm going to have an ID, which is going to be a column of type integer, and it is my primary key. And then I'm going to add the parameter name, which is going to be another column in my database. It's going to be DB string. We're going to limit it to 80 characters, and that's it. So now I have this class that I've registered with SQLAlchemy. So when I create my database, it'll add that table. So here we go, Flask --help. We can see that my new field has shown up right there. So let's say Flask initdb. And that's done. My database just showed up right here. And let's go look in our application. So rather than working with the session at this point, I'm going to say names equals name query all. So I just want to pull all the names out of there. And then if I want to persist that data, I'm just going to say in equals name, and I'm going to pass that in. db.session, and I'm going to add that to the context of the database, and then commit that so it persists into my database. I know that I also want to add a constructor in here, so we're going to say define init. It takes self and name, and that is going to say self.name equals name. So that's going to allow us to just easily create names. All right, so down here, instead of saying names equals session, what I get to do is I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to say db.session.add name, like that. So here, let's take this, and I'm going to just, so I don't have to retype that. There we go. And then db.session.commit. So this is another useful tool for the command line operations, is I'm able to add a whole bunch, create a command line that can bootstrap my database and put a bunch of dummy data in there. That's helpful as you are working with data and testing out different functions. You can populate your database so you don't have to go through your UI to make sure that everything's working. That can be very time consuming, especially if you make any kind of changes to your database and you have to reset the whole thing and you want to test to make sure it's working. So now if I go in here and I say Flask add names, that's going to run through there. Oh, I didn't save it. There we go. So now my names are added. So if I restart the whole Flask, and let's show the browser here. Oh, they're showing up a little bit weird. They're showing up as the representation of my object. So I see that I have 5 names. I know they're going to map to what I put into my command line operation. So let's go back and look at that. If I look here, okay, when I'm going and looping through my names, it's saying for name and names. So instead of being a string, every name object is being just printed out. If I want to get the property, I know that's a name object, and I know, okay, the name property is what I want to display. So let's display that, run, and now when I refresh, let's look at what that looks like. When I refresh what that data looks like, now it's printing out the string values. And I could say, all right, let's add Todd. And now Todd gets added on there as well. And now we have persistent data that's stored in the database. And we can also examine that database. Here we go. I'm just going to open database and view, right here, show that table. All right. So in my database, I can see that that data is being persisted for data access. So this is a real kind of simple example of how to utilize those 3 components. Utilize kind of the model, the data aspect of our application to store data, and then allowing the application.py Flask file to work with and manipulate the data, and it becomes kind of the broker, the controller between the view code, or what the user can work with, and the model code in the back end. And then the templates become our view, which allow us to instruct how do we want the user to be able to consume that information? What do we want to expose to allow them to interact with, to change or add data on the back end? So it's kind of this three-pronged model view controller approach to working with web applications.
And can you please subscribe to Kazoo and Dark Yodeler? I only have 25 subscribers.